Good afternoon to all of our Caltech alumni and friends of Caltech. My name is Helen Kim, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Navigate Conflict and Build Stronger Relationships at Work. Today's speaker is Amy Gallo. Amy is an expert in conflict, communication, and workplace dynamics. She is the author of the Harvard Business Review Guide to Dealing with Conflict, a how-to guidebook that combines the latest management research with practical advice on how to handle conflict professionally and productively. After appearing as a guest in the first 2 seasons, Amy recently joined HBR's Women at Work podcast as a co-host. In her role as a contributing editor at Harvard Business Review, she writes frequently about communicating ideas, leading and influencing people, and building your career. She has contributed to numerous books on feedback, emotional intelligence, and managing others, and is the co-author of the HBR Guide to Building Your Business Case. Gallo is on the faculty of the Emotional Intelligence Coaching Certification Program recently launched by Daniel Goleman. She taught at Brown University and is a graduate of both Brown and Yale University. During the last 10 minutes of the presentation today, Amy will answer questions from the audience. Please feel free to write in your questions at any point during the webinar using the questions feature within the platform. And now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Amy.
Thanks so much, Helen, and thank you all for joining today. I'm very pleased to be presenting today on my favorite topic, which is conflict. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I did want to give everyone a heads up that I'm going to have a couple interactive components here. But definitely have your chat screen open so that you can chime in if you feel comfortable doing so. You can also, during the interactive components, if you don't want to participate in the chat, you can also just think to yourself about the questions that I am posing. So as I said, this is my favorite topic. I wrote the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, and part of the research I did to come up with that guide and come up with what I saw as a straightforward, practical way to deal with difficult conversations and conflict at work was talk to experts from a variety of different fields. So I talked to folks who study emotional intelligence, people at the Harvard Negotiation Project, people who study management science, and I took the best of all of that research and, as I said, turned that into a straightforward, practical approach. As I share the key concepts from this book today, you'll definitely see elements of emotional intelligence research. You'll definitely see elements of neuroscience research, and that's intentional. I'm really trying to bring together a variety of different fields to help us at work to have stronger relationships and to not let difficult conversations and conflict really have such a negative impact on us. So I want to start by asking you to do something. I want you to think about a recent conflict that you've had. And it might be something that happened at work. It might be something that happened at home. It might be an issue you had with a colleague or a client or a boss. It might be something even you had with, let's say, a teenager you have at home. And it might be something that happened today. It might be something that happened 2 weeks ago or even 2 months ago. And I want you to think about when that conflict was happening, what did you say? What did the other person say? What do you wish you could have said? And now I want you to think about how you felt in that moment. And what's the one word you would use to describe how you felt? If you want to put that word into the chat feature, that's great. Again, no pressure if you don't want to. But mostly when I talk about conflict, the types of words I hear are frustration or, anxiety or stress or undervalued. I once even heard someone say that they felt strangled when they were thinking about this conflict. And that is not surprising. What we do know from research is that when we are under stress, and most people do interpret conflict as stress, right, that our brains go into what Dan Goleman calls amygdala hijack, where we lose access to the prefrontal cortex, which is the rational thinking part of our brain. And instead, we're in that fight or flight mode that so many of us are familiar with. Now, the reason I wrote a book about conflict, the reason that I study conflict and really want to help people with it is that conflict often feels like this, right? It feels like a threat. It feels like an attack. And it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, what I found in my research is that conflict had many positive benefits. Now, in order to embrace any of those benefits, we have to get around a common view, a really deeply held belief that we have. And this is true in many cultures, this is true in many organizations, which is that somehow we've come to believe that disagreement is unkind. And I really believe if you take nothing else away from this webinar today, if you just take away this idea that disagreeing does not have to be unkind. And I see this in many organizations where saying, I don't see it the same way is basically, interpreted as you're an idiot, right? And it doesn't have to be that way because there are lots of positive benefits to conflict. And I want to share some of those with you. Number one, we have better work outcomes. So if you and I don't see the project in the same way, we both have different opinions, we put those out there, we're more likely to get to a better work outcome if we can work through those differences of opinions and incorporate both of our perspectives. Or we may collaborate and build off one another's perspectives, getting to a better answer. We also personally have the opportunity to learn and grow. When I have to articulate my perspective, when I have to, really explain the assumptions that I've made, I learn a lot about myself. We also have improved relationships. Now, I have a 12-year-old daughter. She is my emotional intelligence guru. She has convinced me that we all come into this world as emotionally intelligent people, and then we mess ourselves up so that when we're 30 and we're shopping in a bookstore and we see a book on emotional intelligence, we think, I should learn that, when truthfully we all really know it already. So my daughter knows this about improved relationships quite well. Which years ago, she went to a sleepover with a friend of hers, and she came home and I asked her how it was, and she said, it was great. We fought the whole time. And I said, okay, why was that great? And she said, well, because we fought about where to sleep and how late we should stay up and what movie we should watch and whether we should involve Sophie's brother in the game that we were playing. And now we're BFFs, right? And my daughter knows intuitively what the research has shown, which is that when you go through a challenging opportunity or challenging situation with someone, you come out with having a stronger bond. And this is because you've set the precedent that we can have disagreements and our relationship will still survive. Now, fourth, we also know from the research that when conflict is a normal part of interacting with other people at work, when people feel comfortable raising issues, they are much more happy in the job, much more satisfied with their work. And this last benefit that I want to share is really that and this is something I feel very passionately about, is that if you want to have an inclusive work environment, if you want to have an environment where people feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, that you can bring in people with different perspectives and ideas, you have to be able to deal with conflict. Because bringing people from differing backgrounds, perspectives, ways of thinking, conflict is inevitable. And you have to figure out how to navigate through it. So the more that your organization, your team is able to handle conflict in a productive, healthy way, the more likely you're going to have a more inclusive work environment. Now, the question is, of course, how do you get any of those benefits? And I'm going to share with you several of the concepts from my book, as I said. This is the very first one that I want to share. And that is that we tend to have a default approach to conflict. Some of us avoid it, and some of us seek it. And this is quite oversimplified. You'll see there's an arrow here at the bottom of this slide, and that's because obviously no one avoids conflict all of the time. Well, maybe some do. Most people don't do it all the time. Most people don't seek it all the time either. But we do tend to have a default approach. And I want to understand from you, Helen, if you could launch the poll. We're going to launch a poll, and if you could chime in, this is anonymous, of course. how do you generally approach conflict? Do you tend to always seek it, mostly seek it, a little bit of both, or mostly avoid it, or always avoid it? And while you're answering this question, I'm going to tell you a little bit about these styles. So, and you may know this intuitively, but just as a reminder, people who avoid conflict are those are the people who, when a tense topic comes up in a meeting or people start to disagree, that they tend to feel quite uncomfortable. They're the people who sit back, maybe cross their arms, maybe feel like they, slide a little bit under the table. They really would prefer that people get along, that people agree. They prefer that any sort of conflict perhaps is handled offline, certainly not in a public setting. And these are people who tend to value relationships and harmony. And they really, and those are very important to them, and those are great values. I think we can all agree that relationships and harmony are great values. Now, seekers, on the other hand, tend to be people who, when there's a conflict starts to come up in a meeting again, or maybe even over email, they tend to lean into that conflict. They either, really push it. They might even create conflict. And I know this from experience as someone who is a seeker, right? They really get a lot of energy from the disagreement that happens between people, including between themselves and others. And that tends to be because they value directness and honesty. Now, that doesn't mean that, that seekers don't value relationships and harmony. Many of them do. But when forced to choose, they would rather have directness and honesty. And the same for avoiders. Avoiders don't necessarily not value directness and honesty, but they really value relationships and harmony more. Helen, if we've gotten some responses, you can go ahead and close the poll, and I'll continue with the slides if people were able to answer that, and we'll take a look at that.
Yes, I did want to share that 61% of our audience said they mostly avoid conflict, 26% said a little bit of both, and 13% responded mostly seek it, 5% responded always avoid it.
Interesting. So we'd have quite a few avoiders here with us today, and that's great. I think that it does seem to be, in my experience, I've done this workshops in some industries where I see a greater number of seekers, but I'm not surprised at those numbers. Interestingly, I'm not surprised at all that some people say that a good percentage of people actually say that they do both, because for many of us, it will depend on the situation. And, we might be, for example, an avoider with our boss, but a seeker with our mother, right? Or we might be an avoider with our peers, but a seeker with our direct reports, right? It really depends on the situation. Or you might tend to avoid conflict. You might be one of those people who selected mostly avoid it. But when a value that you care a lot about, let's say fairness or equity, is threatened, you become a seeker. And it's really, what's important to know is, what is your default? Where on this continuum do you fall? Because when you go into amygdala hijack, that's going to be where you go. The other thing that can be helpful is to think about what has determined your style. And there's lots of things that do. I have a coaching client, for example, who, grew up in a large Italian family. And he said, in order to get heard, you had to scream. So he's quite used to loud debates, and for him, he works in an organization where most people tend to avoid conflict. And it's really hard for him to understand why people find him threatening, why they, are constantly talking about the volume of his voice or his aggressiveness. And so you really have to understand what's created this, what past experiences have made me who I am. And that might be also cultural norms. Certainly different cultures value directness and confrontation differently. It might also be the office context. Certainly there's some offices, organizations, industries that tend to value direct, honest conversation or direct, honest dealing with conflict more than others. There's lots of places that prefer, again, that tension be resolved behind closed doors or one-on-one. And there's also gender norms. If we had 3 more hours, I could go into all of the research around gender and conflict. Obviously, we don't have that, but I will just say briefly, there isn't any research that shows that women tend to avoid conflict more than men, or that men tend to avoid it more than women. What we do know is that typically what we expect of women, especially at work, is that we expect them to avoid conflict. And when they do seek it, they tend to be penalized more. There's some classic research from the Harvard Kennedy School that shows that when women negotiate their salaries, for example, they are penalized for doing so. Men and women report not wanting to work with that person, whereas men, when they negotiate for their salaries, also do not experience that penalty. In fact, men and women report wanting to work with that person. Now, again, this is complicated research that we could spend hours discussing, but I just want to point that out, that sometimes we have expectations for how someone should behave based on their gender around conflict. And it's important to remember how that has influenced, or to keep in mind how that's influenced your own style as well as the style of the people around you. And I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end if you have them. Now, the second concept I want to share with you is a approach I've developed around how to analyze a specific conflict. One of the things that's challenging about amygdala hijacked is, as I mentioned, we don't think clearly. So when someone raises their voice at us in a meeting, when someone sends a passive-aggressive email, for example, we just sort of respond. And we respond usually in that fight or flight mode, which is not particularly useful. So what I encourage instead is to think about that conflict. Really analyze it before you respond. Now, the way I'm going to explain it, it may sound like these steps are something you have to say, you've raised your voice at me, I'm sorry, I have to go back to my desk for 4 hours and analyze this, and then I'll come back with a response. No, that's not what I want you to do at all. Of course, sometimes you do need to buy yourself some time, and we'll talk about how to do that. But more often than not, these are 4 steps that you can do in your brain, in your mind, really quickly. It can take as little as 30 seconds to go through these really quickly once you get good at them. So I want to go through them each in step. The first thing, and this is probably the last thing you want to do, particularly when you're in amygdala hijack, because we tend to be naturally narcissistic in that mode, but you really want to think about the other person. And this is not out of generosity, although I do encourage generosity. This is more of a strategic move for you, because for 2 reasons. Number one, if you can understand a little bit more about the other person, what their interests are, why they want what they want, why they're disagreeing with you, you're going to be able to better propose a resolution that meets their needs and your needs. And that's a real position of power to be in. So this is really about gathering information about interests. For anyone who's familiar with negotiation theory, interests play a big role. You have interests, the other person has interests. The more you can understand those, the better. So you want to think through, where is this person coming from? What's motivating them? What do they want out of this situation? The second reason this step is so important is that very often we become so focused on ourselves in this situation and ruminating about what we want and what we need and how we're being hurt or disrespected or disregarded in this situation. And that positioning, that mindset is not a place of position of power. It's not a place where you can have a productive discussion. So instead of thinking about yourself, think about the other person as a way to break that rumination cycle. Now, I want to tell you a quick story about my daughter again, because she really embodies this step, this concept. We were, a few years ago, we're driving on the highway, and these 2 motorcyclists came whizzing by. They didn't have helmets on, and I'm thinking this was a teachable moment. In case my daughter ever gets on a motorcycle in her life, I want her to wear a helmet. I'm going to point out that they're not wearing helmets and how dangerous that is. And I start saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're not wearing helmets. That's just so dangerous. If they ever got hit, they would certainly be hurt. And she got in on it too and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe anyone would do that. She even pointed out that one was a woman. Why would a woman make that choice? Which was interesting. And then we were both quiet for a moment, and she said, Mommy, maybe they're on their way to buy helmets. Now, I know pretty much, I'm 100% sure that they were not on their way to buy helmets, but it was the most generous interpretation of that situation. And that's what I want you to do. So when you're in a disagreement with Khalil, your colleague, let's say, instead of thinking, okay, what's going on with Khalil? Instead of thinking, oh, Khalil's a passive aggressive jerk, this is how he always behaves, right? I want you to instead think, what's the most generous possible interpretation? Maybe Khalil didn't get enough sleep last night. Maybe he's under pressure from his boss. Maybe he's afraid of losing his job. Maybe that's what's motivating. Because you don't need to know specifically why Khalil behaved the way he did. That's not, first of all, that you're not going to be able to figure that out. Instead, you want to really come up with many theories. What could those possibly be, so that you're not so wedded to your interpretation of the events and of the situation? Because when you sit down to talk with Khalil, or when you respond to the comment he just made, you're going to be in a much more generous mindset, which is going to put him in a much more generous mindset if you're not so wedded to a negative interpretation. So that's the first step. The second step is to think about the type of conflict. Now, most often, we assume when something goes wrong at work, we assume that there's some personal element to it, right? Our personalities clash, or that person's never respected me, or there's some sort of issue with the relationship. Now, that relationship conflicts certainly do happen, and that's often an element, but more often than not, conflicts really start as one of three other types. And the most common we know from the literature is task conflict. And that's a disagreement over the what. So what's the goal of this project? What are we trying to achieve? What's our objective? This is sometimes really at the base of what conflicts that feel very quite personal is just a disagreement over the goal, or a misunderstanding or misalignment of the goal. The second most common is process. So we may agree on the goal, but we don't necessarily agree on how. So perhaps we agree the goal of our project is to increase revenue, but we disagree about how we're going to do that. I think we're going to roll out a new product across multiple markets to try to increase revenue. You think we're going to extend a particular product line, right? So it's a disagreement over how we're going to achieve that. The fourth type is status, and that's a disagreement over who has the power and who is in charge. So I see this all the time in organizations. Matrixed organizations, for example, are very flat organizations where people have tried to get rid of hierarchy. Or cross-functional teams is another place. Really, it's who gets to make the call on this issue. Right? And that can be about resources, that can be about time. And understanding, part of the reason you want to understand the type of conflict is that if you can understand the different threads of the issue. So sometimes a disagreement starts, but it's not clear exactly what we're disagreeing about. But if you can identify the type, then you can have a basis for the conversation. So you can say, I think we're disagreeing over the goal and how to achieve it. Or I think we're disagreeing over the goal and who gets to make the call here, right? And that helps you have a more focused, productive conversation about the disagreement. Now, of course, conflicts rarely fall into one category. More often than not, they fall into all of these categories. As I like to say, they are a hot mess of all four. So really, again, you're not trying to categorize it into one particular category, but you're trying to understand the different threads of the conflict and the disagreement and what's going on. Now, I want to do a little bit of an exercise with you, and you can use the chat if you'd like, or you can think about this to yourself. What I'm going to do is share a couple of scenarios with you, and I want you to think about the type of conflict. So as you read this scenario, is this a task, process, status, or relationship conflict, or some combination? So I'll give you a moment to read. All right, so here, what is going on here? What type of conflict is this? This is a classic process conflict, right? So we might agree on the task. We actually don't know from this description, but we clearly disagree on how, right? What's the timeline? Do we need to do it by this time or this time? Now, often underneath process disagreements, right? So if you disagree on whether you need to do this for a trade show or within the fiscal year, you might also disagree on the goal. Because if you don't agree on the goal will often dictate the how. So you might have both going on here. That's important to keep in mind. Let's look at another one. What type of conflict do you think this is? Is this task, process, status, relationship? The way I interpret this one is that there's a couple things. One, certainly status, right? She's saying, I'll make the decision on this. So she's trying to exercise her status or her position. There's also, she's raising her voice. So I see that as a bit of a relationship conflict as well. There's some sort of disrespect there. And again, there might also be some task and process depending on the project. You might not agree on what the goal of this new project is, or the goal of coming up with of a brainstorm, for example. You might disagree on how the decision-making process should go. So this one certainly could be all four. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is this person, the head of your division, may not see this as a conflict at all and may see it quite differently. So when you go and identify the type of conflict, you're doing that as not this is the truth, this is the final answer, but you're doing it as an exercise so that you can come to the table when it's time to have the conversation and say, here's what I think we're disagreeing about. Does that sound right? Right? Because you want to get the input from the other person, and you're not always going to see it the same way. Let's do one more. This is a pretty serious one. Someone's come into your office, accused you of discrimination. And I really see here lots of things going on. Certainly status, right? When you are now the boss, you have authority over this person. I think this person is really threatened by that. And is calling that out in a clear status conflict. There's certainly probably a relationship. I think being accused of discrimination might indicate there's something going on in your relationship as well. It might be process. Maybe this person didn't agree with the process that was used to decide on the promotion. Now, you have to also keep in mind it's possible, and we don't know from this scenario, that you were discriminating. And that is important to keep in mind. Again, the other person is going to see this very differently. So something that you think is completely off base, completely unacceptable, the other person may just see as quite rational and quite reasonable. And that's important to keep in mind, that it's not always your perspective that is necessarily true. You are just one person in this discussion. Oh, I do have one more. So let's do one more. Right. So here, this is a tricky one as well, because this person has insinuated you're wasting your time. I do think there's a little bit of a relationship conflict there. Certainly status, right? If you're wasting your time is not as valuable as my time, or I'm more senior, so therefore I'm not going to spend time on something that's not as valuable. Certainly there could be a process conflict of, how do we know when something is done? How do we make the call on that? Who gets to make the call on that? There's some of that status. But then there's also the goal. So what is the goal of this report? And that will certainly dictate when it needs to be finished, and when we call it done. So this is a good example of one that is quite likely all three. All right, so let's move on to the next step, and that's to determine your goal. And what I mean here is that oftentimes, because of that amygdala hijack, we get into a situation where we just simply respond. We don't think about what is it that I actually want out of this conversation. Now, if you're anything like me, oftentimes your goal is to just be right and to prove the other person wrong. That is a terrible goal, I can say from experience. So really, you want to think about, what is it I need out of this conversation? Is it that I need this project to get done? Is it that we need this email conversation to end? Is it that we need our bosses to get the information they need? Or is it that you just need to preserve the relationship with the other person? And that really is going to dictate how you go about the conversation, how you decide to address it. And that's going to really help you, determine how you want to address the situation. And that's the fourth step, to pick your option. Now, I like to talk about 4 options. This is what I cover in the book. The first option is something that I think is terribly underused in organizations, and that is the do nothing option. And this is where you just let the comment go, you don't respond to the email, or you just sort of agree to go with the other person's way here. We do it all the time and without even noticing it, in fact. And sometimes when we're really worked up about something, we really need to ask ourselves, is the best approach here to do nothing? And it often is, especially if the issue is a one-time event that's not likely to be repeated, or if it's someone was not capable of having a reasonable conversation. Perhaps they're extreme avoider or an extreme seeker. There's 2 caveats to this option, though, and that is that, number one, if you tell yourself that you are going to do nothing, but then you go back to your desk and ruminate about it, or go find your friend at work and complain about this person, or spend your entire commute on your way home, having an imaginary fight with this person, that's not doing nothing, right? That's doing a whole lot of something. So it's much better if you cannot let it go, right? You really do have to let it go. If you can't let it go, then you need to choose one of the other options instead. And you might try to do nothing and realize you can't, and that's fine. And then you move on. The second option, the second caveat here is, if you are an extreme avoider, or someone who selected on the poll, always avoid conflict, and you say, oh, do nothing, I love that option, right? I do that all the time. That is not, it can't be a default reaction. It has to be a thought through, careful consideration, right? I'm doing nothing because it is the best for this situation when I think about what my goal is and what the other person, I've thought through what the other person needs, that really doing nothing is the best option here. The second option is to address indirectly. And I cover this a lot in the book, but I'm going to just quickly summarize for you. This is an option where you don't necessarily sit down and hash it out. That's the address directly. But rather you maybe use a story or a metaphor to indicate to the person a resolution for the situation. Or maybe you involve a third party. Maybe there's someone you both trust who you can go and bend their ear and say, I'm really in it with Khalil. Can you help me sort of think through how to solve this? And that person might then go talk to Khalil as well. This is, for many places, organizational cultures, this is considered passive-aggressive and indirect. Obviously, it is indirect, but there are cultures in which this is incredibly appropriate way. And I've seen people, it takes a lot of skill, but I've seen people really masterfully, address a conflict indirectly, where they've sat down in the meeting and said, we faced something similar at a previous company where I worked, and here's what we did, right? So rather than saying, Jim, your idea is wrong, you can say, here's a resolution that might work. Just from telling a story or even using a metaphor. When I was a management consultant, I worked in Korea for several months on a project there. And Korea in particular tends to be a culture where there's not a direct confrontation. And this was something, they addressed many conflicts indirectly. And it was a really useful way to address problems that we couldn't come to resolutions by talking about them directly. The third option is to address directly. Now, I'm going to talk, the rest of the webinar is about how to do this. So I'll just say here that this is really where you sit down Either you have the conversation when it happens, or you sit down and schedule a meeting, that later that day or next week. And this is where you're really sort of face to face, hopefully, and we'll talk about that, really just talking it through. And the last option, which I refer to as the last resort option, is to exit the relationship. I say last resort because you have to have tried one of the other options, if not all of them, before you decide to do this. And really big caveat, this isn't always possible. You can't always get a new boss. You can't get relocated to another team. It's not always feasible or practical to leave your job. But I like to mention it because for some people it really is the only option that's going to get them out of a long-term, really difficult conflict. But again, you have to have tried the others before you decide to do this. Now, you might try one or two of these and realize they don't work for you in this particular situation and try something else. It's really particular to the situation, to you and the other person and your goal, what you decide to do. Now, as I said before, you're not going to, run home, analyze, or run back to your desk, analyze a conflict, and then, come back 3 hours later. But sometimes you do need to buy yourself some time. And if you do, it's often okay to walk away, particularly if someone is yelling at you or if the situation has gotten really tense. You can also ask for a break. You have to own the need for a break. So you have to be willing to say, I need to go get a glass of water, or I'm not ready to talk about this. Can we talk about this tomorrow? Can I set up a meeting with you tomorrow? It rarely is effective to say, you need a break, you need to calm down. I think we all know how it feels when someone tells us to calm down. Also, I have here, don't hit send, and I really mean this. It is not productive to have these difficult conversations generally over email, which unfortunately is often where we have them. If things get tense, if people start to really disagree, and you can tell things are not going well, pick up the phone, try to schedule an in-person meeting. There's tons and tons of research that shows that text is not a good way to convey nuance or emotion. So if things are going to be tricky between you and a colleague or you and a team, it's better to have that conversation, not just for you, but for everyone involved, face-to-face when you can, or even by video chat or by phone. Even voice conveys a lot more emotion than just text. All right, so these are the steps. Summarize them here for you, but let's talk about once you've decided to actually address a conflict directly, which is often, one of the more common ways to do it. Let's talk about how you get ready for that conversation. And I talk about getting ready in 3 ways: mentally, strategically, and logistically. So first of all, mentally, you really need to check your mindset. If you go into the conversation assuming it's going to go horribly, then guess what? It's going to. So really think about the conversation as a fact-finding mission, as a way for you to get some questions answered. What don't you know that you need to know? And what do you think you might be able to learn that you don't know yet? You also want to take your counterpart's perspective. So if you've done this ideally when you analyze the conflict, but do it again. What do you know about the other person? How are they seeing the situation? What about yourself and how you've behaved so far might be making the situation worse? And then lastly, vent. So don't go into the room completely angry or frustrated or stressed. Really try to get a lot of that emotion out ahead of time. And you might do that by venting ideally to someone outside the organization, maybe a spouse, maybe a friend, maybe a former coworker, as someone you can tell the good, the bad, the ugly. Because if you show up ready and much more calm, the conversation is going to go much better. The second type of preparation is strategically. So think through what you're going to say. That does not mean you should script it. I can guarantee the other person will not play their role if you decide to script it. So instead, really think through what are the key messages you want to convey? What are the questions that you want to ask, right? And just give some thought to that. And also prepare for multiple scenarios. So the conversation will not always go the way you think it's going to go. So think through things like, what if the person introduces, a whole new set of information that you didn't have? What if they start to cry? What if you start to yell? And you're not going to think through every potential situation, but this is really meant to help you stay out of that amygdala hijack. If you thought through, here are some things that might go wrong, you're at least prepared that things may go wrong. And that really will help you stay in a sort of calm, centered frame of mind. You also need to prepare logistically, and that means choosing the right time and place and put some thought into this, right? You don't want to have this conversation at 9 a.m. on Monday or late in the day when everyone's trying to get out the door. You certainly, if it's a conflict, you don't want to have the conversation in someone's office. You don't want it to be, territorial. You really want to just choose a nice neutral place. I think if you're if you're dealing with someone who's an extreme avoider, for example, you might want to, choose a place that's more public. I know as someone who does tend to yell occasionally when I get stressed, that if you take me to a coffee shop, I'm going to be much better behaved than I would in a conference room, for example. So really think through what's going to set up this conversation for success, both for me, but also that's going to put the other person in the right frame of mind. Now, once you've prepared, let's talk a little bit about how to have a productive conversation. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about how to open, because I think really opening the conversation is incredibly important. You want to start by stating your shared goal. What is it you both have in common? Right? What are you both trying to achieve? And almost always you have a shared goal. Even if you disagree over the goal of that specific project, you probably are both invested in making the company, the team, a success, right? So what is your shared goal? Then label the type of conflict. So I said this earlier, but I'll repeat it. So if you're disagreeing over the how, you might say, I see this as a disagreement over what we're trying to achieve, right? Do you see it the same way? And really, you want to engage them in that conversation, because if you can agree on what you're disagreeing about, you've already started the conversation. You've already put yourselves on the same side of the table. That's what negotiation experts often talk about. So you want to see yourselves on the same side of the table, solving the conflict together, rather than seeing yourselves as adversaries. And you also want to make your good intentions clear. And you might say that explicitly. Resolving this is going to require us working together. I'm really invested in that. Or I've always valued our working relationship. I know that's going to survive this. I'm looking forward to getting to the other side of this. Right? Anything that really shows that you are invested in the conversation. And you might even ask a question. So saying that, I see this conversation really about the goal of the project. Do you agree? Right? That demonstrates asking them, do you agree, really shows that you are interested in collaborating, not just sort of ramming your viewpoint down their throat. The second thing you need to do during the conversation is manage your emotions, and this can be really challenging, but this is also where basic mindfulness techniques come in handy. You want to breathe deeply, not in a way that the other person wonders what you're doing, but really just stay in touch with your body. Really, think, if you need to, imagine yourself as a fly in the wall observing the conversation. You want to do anything that from your personal experience helps take down your blood pressure, helps reconnect you with that, prefrontal cortex, so that you can continue to stay in your rational mind. And all of us hopefully have tricks and techniques that help us do this well. And the key is to find some that are subtle, so that you don't have to, show the person that you're breathing deeply, taking 5 deep breaths, but that you can do it in the midst of this conversation. And if you notice yourself sliding, you then have to just think about, okay, well, do I need to take a break here? And that might be what you need to do. The same for the other person. If they really seem worked up, stuck on a particular topic, you may say, you know what, I think we need to take a break, or better yet, I need to take a break, and can we come back to this? Now, your primary task in this conversation is to listen to the other person's perspective, because as I said at the beginning, one of your main strategies here is to understand the other person's interests, because the more you understand your own interests and their interests, the more likely you'll come up with a resolution that will incorporate both. So ask a ton of questions, open-ended questions. What assumptions have you made here? How do you see this? Tell me what I haven't understood about this project? How is your boss thinking about this? What do you think our client is thinking about this, right? Just ask a lot of questions to try to get their perspective. And generally, asking questions also helps people think about things they may not have thought of. They certainly may not have analyzed this particular conversation before having it. So it gives them a chance to really think through and articulate the assumptions and ideas that are behind their perspective. In addition to listening, you also need to make sure your viewpoint is heard. For avoiders, this can be particularly difficult, and one of the tricks I recommend is to write down 3 things that you want to make sure the other person hears. And just keep those on a piece of paper in front of you during the conversation so that you can turn to them when you feel it's not appropriate to talk or you're nervous about talking. Really look at those. Make sure that you're and ensuring that they're seeing your perspective as well. And I've even had people in conversations say, you know what, I'm going to refer to these 3 things because these were the 3 points I really wanted to make sure that you heard. No one has been offended that will be offended that you've prepared for the conversation. So let's talk about what a resolution looks like, because in the course of the conversation, sometimes a resolution naturally evolves. In fact, sometimes you analyze the conflict and you see a resolution, right from the start. You realize you've misunderstood or you presumed something about the other person and their behavior and their goals that you now realize it was a presumption, right? So, but hopefully in that course of a conversation, but if you need to propose a resolution, it's helpful to think about what are the elements. Number 1, it has to satisfy interests, and it's not going to satisfy everyone's interests. Generally, in a conflict, there will be interests that will not be able to be met, but you have to make sure it satisfies some of yours and some of the other persons or some of the other parties. That's really important in a resolution. Otherwise, why would anyone agree to it? It also has to be fair and reasonable. Now, if I polled all of you here listening to this webinar today about what these words mean, what's fair and reasonable, we would all have different interpretations. So it can be difficult to decide what is actually fair, what is actually reasonable. And here, negotiation experts have a trick, which they tend to think of as the third party endorsement. So if you were to share the resolution, so let's say we have a disagreement, we decide we're going to do X, Y, and Z. If we showed X, Y, and Z to our bosses, for example, or to an outside party, would they consider it fair and reasonable? And you can even say that in the conversation. You can say, when you're proposing a resolution, say, I think this is fair and reasonable. How do you think others outside of this? How do you think this other team that we collaborate would see this? And you generally can have some discussion about how other people would see it that helps you come to a shared understanding. Now, lastly, the resolution should leave the relationship intact, because if you've come to a resolution and you can't stand each other, you don't want to work with one another again, that's not a particularly productive resolution, right? So really, ideally, the process you've gone through, the resolution that you've proposed allows you to stay in relationship with one another and allows you to have a good working relationship. Now, sometimes that's not possible, and sometimes the relationship will be damaged. There might be some emotional shrapnel that's as a result of this disagreement. And here's some advice about how to repair that relationship if that's the case. Be patient. It takes time, certainly. And sometimes all you need is a week or 2 between the disagreement and the next time you interact. And sometimes that can really help smooth things over. You also, though, want to stay in relationship with that person. So ask questions. Ask them questions about their work. Ask them questions about a project that you're collaborating on. Anything that shows that you're interested in what they think and what they're working on. You also want to reestablish reciprocity. So that might mean, if they've given something up as a result of this disagreement and the resolution you proposed, demonstrate that you're also willing to give something up, right? Give them something. And this might be as simple as grabbing them a coffee when you head out to the coffee shop, or it might be, offering to help out with a project or giving them a resource that they didn't have, right? Or changing the deadline on something that shows that you're interested in staying in a relationship. And while things might be tense, you also need to spend time together. Don't avoid them. in the hallways. Don't avoid eye contact in meetings. Really just make sure that you're staying in relationship with that person, staying in contact with that person. And things may not be immediately, copacetic, but eventually over time, it most likely will be. Now, I do want you to do one thing before we turn to questions, and I just want you to take a moment to think about for yourself, and you don't need to share this in the chat, but really for yourself, what's one thing when it comes to conflict, when it comes to difficult conversations, what's one thing that you will do differently in the future? And if you want to write that down on a piece of paper so you have it, maybe on a Post-it near your desk, or something you even want to share with a coworker or with a friend about something that you're going to do differently going forward, it's a great way to commit to yourself to really, gain the skills, the confidence that you need to handle difficult conversations. If you want to learn more, you can certainly check out my book. I have my website here as well as my Twitter handle in case you want to follow me. I'm happy to answer questions now, Helen. I'll turn it over to you if there are questions we can talk about.
Thank you, Amy. We have a few questions. One audience member asks, my main concern with work conflict right now is a person who displays narcissistic traits. I'm willing to deal with conflict and not take it personally, but they make it personal and will not listen to the other side. How do we work with people like this who aren't open to working it out and finding resolution?
Right. So the narcissist is a really, really difficult person to work with. The sort of extreme passive aggressive person is another person. There's lots of these archetypes that it can be really difficult. And I can share with you tools and tactics, but when someone's just really dug into their way of doing things and really stubborn about having things done their way, it can be incredibly difficult. And I think, especially with a severe narcissist, it's one of the things you need to do is just learn to protect yourself. So, and that might be emotionally, right? There's really learning not to take it personally. This person is so focused on themselves. They've got their own limitations. And truthfully, one of my favorite approaches for dealing with people like this is to say, their punishment is to wake up every day and they have to be themselves, which they must be unhappy to be because it can't be fun to be them. They probably don't have good relationships. They're probably not, getting satisfying work done, so really think about how can I protect myself emotionally from the damage that this person is doing. Also protect yourself, make sure you document any commitments they make, make sure you might also enlist other people. So if there's other people in your office who can really be on your side, can advocate for you, in a meeting can say, I actually think the way you're proposing makes sense. Can we try that out? Right? I think that really trying to sort of bolster yourself so that you're not constantly at the whim of this narcissist can be really helpful. And I think I'm glad that you asked this question because it's really one of the core tenets of any of this difficult conversations, having strong relationships at work, navigating conflict, is that you cannot change another person. You can show up, you can do all this work, you can analyze the conflict, prepare for the conversation, but if they are going to be completely unreasonable, you're very unlikely to change their way. And it's as frustrating as it is. Sometimes you just have to realize this is not going to go the way I want it to go, and I have to figure out another tactic here. I have to figure out how to handle what I can handle. But I have found what I have seen work in some organizations is really when people bond together. If there's someone who lots of people recognize as a narcissist is really going to insist on their way, have people bond together to counter that in a conversation. And sometimes that will work, and sometimes, unfortunately, because we can't change people, it won't. Any other questions, Helen?
Yes. We have one audience member who asks, what is helpful if you truly believe the other party is not rational or interested in conflict resolution?
Yeah, and again, it is sometimes you're not going to, you're going to be sitting with someone who has no interest in resolving the conflict. They either are happy to ignore the situation completely. They're happy to just bulldoze their way through, so that they get their way. Sometimes they're going to be, completely irrational. And again, you cannot change the way people behave. One of the things that I find most helpful in dealing, particularly with difficult people, again, narcissists from the previous question, or someone who seems totally uninterested, is to figure out what is it that they do care about. Do they care about looking good to their boss? Do they care about impressing this client? Do they care about a bonus at the end of the year? Figure out what it is that's truly motivating them. And can you frame the resolution as a way of, or even the discussion as a way of somehow achieving that goal? Can you, if they care a lot about impressing their boss, can you involve their boss in the conversation so that they'll become, more invested in it? Anything that you can do to make sure you're thinking about what they truly care about and aligning the conversation with that can be really helpful. There are people who are going to be so irrational, it's not going to be worth having the conversation. Generally, though, I believe most people are quite rational, or not quite rational, are a little bit rational, I should say. And sometimes if you really dig deep into sort of what their motivation is, if you ask them some questions about what they care about, how they're thinking about this, what assumptions they make, you can really unearth some of their attention and some of their motivation to actually solve the problem.
It looks like we have time for just one more question. The question is, framing works well for goal and process conflicts, but what if you think relationship or status is a significant part of it?
Yeah, and I'm glad for this question. Thank you to whoever asked it, because I think when you are framing the conflict, it's hard to say. I think we have a complete personality clash, right? You don't want to set that up in that way, and that can be difficult. I do think what you do want to do in terms of framing is think about what is our shared goal. What is it that we both want to achieve here? How do we get on the same page? And so you may not necessarily label the type of conflict, but you might say, here's our shared goal. This is both what we want to achieve. We have not been seeing eye to eye on this. And then one trick that I really like is particularly around status conflicts and relationship conflicts. This comes out of some research some people at Columbia University did, is you then ask for their advice. And this seems a little bit counterintuitive, but you might say, well, here we're having this conflict. We're not able to see eye to eye. What's your advice about how we should handle this? How do you think we should approach this? Because what that does, and you might even say, I like this phrasing too, is what would you do if you were in my shoes? Because that encourages them to take a moment and try to be empathetic, to try to see it from your perspective. And the questioning really sort of gets them invested in solving the problem together. And sometimes if what you really need, particularly in a personality or a status conflict, is you need the sense that you're in it together. Because if you can get that, sometimes that sort of neutralizes some of the relationship conflict. So really asking them questions about how they see the situation, how they would like to resolve it, and again, really relying on that common goal that you have. Thank you for that question. That's a really good one.
We don't have time. We run out of time. I'd like to thank Amy for leading an engaging discussion today. Thank you to all of our participants for attending today's webinar. You'll receive a survey and a follow-up email with a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of the Caltech Alumni Association, enjoy the rest of your day.